Good afternoon. I'm Young-Sik Bong, a research fellow at the Asan Institute. I'll be the moderator for this panel, which is one of the last panels in sixth session today. That means that I don't have an answer for your questions regarding bolstering counter-proliferation regime, but I do have four distinguished scholars and experts who might help you find the answers to a very complicated question on counter-proliferation regime. Recently, the debates have been shifting from focusing on taking care of nuclear technology and materials to going after the problem states, the clients or producers. And the strategic shift has been from resorting to multinational legal framework to rather unilateral or even bilateral limited group actions. We have a fascinating and very productive conversation on a similar issue at the network lunch today, thanks to excellent moderation of Matt. We examine a lot of issues, including how you conceptualize or how you deal with the conceptual and definitional differences between counter-proliferation regime and non-proliferation regime. What are the emphasis, difference of emphasis, or different aspects, whether you use primarily military options as opposed to diplomatic options and economic sanctions? What are the targets? You go after states and organizations or the technology and materials, whether these non-proliferation regime and counter-proliferation regimes are contradictory or complementary, whether which one is first line of defense or second line of defense. So I'm very confident that in this panel for the next 75 minutes, we will also have a very productive and engaging conversation on bolstering, how to bolster counter-proliferation regime. It is my intention as a moderator to proliferate good ideas and perspectives. So I'd like to make it as interactive as possible, not only among speakers, but also between speakers and the general audience. Without further ado, I'd like to introduce to you the first speaker, Dr. Choi Kang of the iFunds.
Should I start?
Sure. Okay. The opening remarks should be around 7 minutes.
I try to be very, very brief because I'm not an expert in counter-proliferation field. Rather, I'm a journalist on this one. But actually, the reason I decided to come to this panel is I like to show my idea as an outsider who has observed the progress we made for the past 10 years and then raise some questions. So I like to learn more about this counter-proliferation regime here. As an outsider, actually, as an outsider, I can say there's some real meaningful progress we made over the past 10 years. First of all, I think there's a physical growth of participating countries over the past 10 years. We started with 10 countries. Nowadays, more than 100 countries are participating in the PSI in one form or another. So it seems to me that we have built a kind of international consensus and norm in dealing with the possibility of proliferation of WMD. So I think that's a very good positive sign. Of course, there are still many challenges ahead of us, but actually it seems to me that we have at least a consensus among at least half of the UN members in endorsing this PSI issue. Second, actually, it seems to me that we have been able to breaking the myth and also increase awareness, public awareness of the nature of PSI. Of course, initially, there was kinds of misunderstanding on PSI, especially because actually PSI represent the foremost form of counter-proliferation activities we have seen over the past 10 years. So, for example, in Korea, when PSI was introduced, there's a myth it would interfere into our jurisdictional rights and maybe interfere into inter-Korean relations and maybe could act as a kind of negative factor in improving the relation between the two Koreas. But over the years, the various activities and public outreach program have contributed to better understanding of the nature of PSI. So the second point, but still there are some reservations coming from the other related ministries. So I don't know whether we have been able to overcome interagency coordination and also the interconnectedness of this issue with others. In the meantime, still, I think this unlike this non-proliferation regime, the PSI is more action-oriented regime. Of course, non-proliferation such as NPT or the BWC like that is more norm and also regulation, but it doesn't contain any real action-oriented one. But PSI, which usually emphasize interdiction activities and cooperation among the participating countries, is more action-oriented one. There's one difference we can just say on this PSI issue. But still, I think there are many things to be accomplished in the coming days and years. For example, the major countries, some major countries have not signed on or have now shown their intention to fully participate in PSI. For example, the China, the key factor in Northeast Asian perspective. So we have talked about some kinds of the effectiveness of PSI in and around the Korean Peninsula, but it was hampered by the Chinese reservation in enforcing the PSI in and around the Korean Peninsula. So that kinds of things still should be addressed at the global level, and by saying it's not just only a regional or peninsula-wise issue, rather it's a global issue. So I hope the still non-participating countries could be able to join the PSI one way or another. And let me turn into my own assessment of our current situation and challenges ahead of us. First of all, of course, everybody knows that there could be more actors, especially non-state actors, who would like to get an access to these sensitive materials and equipment and technologies. How we can deny these non-state actors from getting access to this material or the technologies is quite critical. Of course, state-to-state cooperation would be very effective, but in order to have more effective control over these non-state actors, we need to have more agencies involved in this action, and also we need more information sharing. But that could be a challenge ahead of us. Second, of course, we have to have more, as I said before, still there are 98 countries who have not signed or have not shown the intention to join the PSI. We have to bring in them in our own circle. That's one. The second point. The third point, I think that still we cannot, what would be the measure to prevent the proliferation coming from the pariah state cooperation, Iran, North Korea connection, or Iran, Myanmar, the North Korean Myanmar connection, or North Korean Syrian connection. How we can cut off that kinds of connection would be quite challenging ahead of us. And of course, actually, we need to have more domestic infrastructures which would ensure us to the effectiveness of PSI, especially the related interagency coordination. In Korean case, the Foreign Ministry, Defense Ministry, Ministry of Trade, Ministry of Unification are all involved in that process. But each ministry has different position on certain issues. So how we can have more effective interagency coordination to ensure the effective international cooperation. So that could be the one. And also this could be the burden sharing issue. How we are going to share the burden ahead of us, which actually needs to enhance the effectiveness of the activities one. And also this, the legal problem, I don't know whether we have been able to overcome the legal problems. Still there are ongoing debate about the legal problems. So and the final point I'd like to say this should be more a process, not just on interdiction, all the processes, how we can detect, locate, inspect, identify, and interfere. And then what would be the next, the final step? How we are going to this transfer or the material we seize by interdicting all these things. I think some details should be further investigated and worked out among the countries in the region. So I think this, for that regard, I'd like to conclude by suggesting some following point. First of all, I'd like to have more capacity building cooperation among the participating countries, especially how we can ensure the effective domestic infrastructures among the participating countries. So of course, and also and second point, I think we have to think about to have a better understanding among the public, how we can increase public support for this international visions. And also the other thing, as actually Mr. Bong Young-shi already mentioned, how we are going to connect this counter-proliferation regime with the non-proliferation regime. And final point, I like to see the advancement for the institutionalization of this process. We have Operation Expert Group meeting, which is more action-oriented one. Through that, we have built up some kinds of awareness and spirit. But actually, if we want to have a more effective counter-proliferation regime, we need to have an institution. For example, the Chemical Weapons Convention has the OPCW, which carries out all the details. So how we are going to introduce the institution which will carry out this mission. Let me stop there. Thank you.
All right, thank you so much, Dr. Che. The second speaker is Dr. Pierce Cordon of American Association for the Advanced Science, also visiting scholar at the Center for Science, Technology, and Security Policy. Welcome.
Thank you, and it's a pleasure to be here in Seoul, the first time for me to visit the Republic of Korea. I thought I might start by sort of saying that I spent some time thinking about the use of terminology here, where we talk about countering proliferation or non-proliferation, and I have to say that I come at it from the perspective of having spent most of my working life working on the sort of the legal arrangement end of things, where the objective is to put together binding international agreements. For example, the Test Ban Treaty or the Chemical Weapons Convention, the Biological Weapons Convention. And I think it's fair to say in that context that there's a spectrum of initiatives that can support what I think is pretty well universally shared as our objective of getting a strengthened international security and stability globally in a world in which you don't have nuclear weapons. Well, what does that mean? Well, it means that you're not only disarming, getting rid of nuclear weapons, but you're dealing with not wanting more proliferation, so you're in that respect countering it. But the word that doesn't seem to be used very much, and the one I invite you to just think about, is that the objective here is, first of all, to stop anybody else, or not to have anybody else acquire nuclear weapons. But at some point, as you move down the ladder towards zero, you're reversing proliferation. So I think there's a number of terms that you can bring to bear here, but within the spectrum of this discussion, we're looking at arrangements that are, on the face of it, not at least initially legally binding, but they can certainly deal with the situations that we have, which regrettably include the need to address new nuclear weapon powers prior to a definitive reversal of proliferation. So I'd suggest that it might be useful to look at the precedent from the European world, where you had the development over time of what are called confidence and security building measures, or CSBMs, and you can look at those along the lines of what is a series of documents, the Vienna documents of the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe. I'm looking at those because they apply to a limited group. So it's not one state, but it's not universal, and they are not legally binding, but they are negotiated, they were and continue to be worked on by the members of the group. And so they have the attraction of being accepted in detail from the outset. So it's not just a single state putting something out and then seeing how many others you can bring into it, but everybody in the group. And in the case of the organization, now the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, it was the Conference on Security and Cooperation in Europe, has plus or minus 50 members, so it's a reasonably broad group. You can think now in terms of what you might want to look at in the context of countering proliferation today about radiological and nuclear materials. Any state or group of states can commit to trying to lock those materials up, to securing them, whether they're in a nuclear reactor, and spent fuel storage site, medical facility, or elsewhere. So you commit against their theft and to protecting those facilities against the dispersal of radioactivity from them. A group of states, Asia or elsewhere, can adopt agreed standards, and you can do that with a view, ultimately, to their global adaptability. So that's not an ideal endpoint of a treaty, but you could also consider an agreement among members of a group not to develop or use radiological weapons. Well, why that? It's a defined weapon of mass destruction. Nobody's really interested in them then. But it would be an earnest indication of willingness to take even more important steps. What other kinds of confidence and security building measures might you consider? An advance notification of military maneuvers, ballistic or cruise missile tests, or space launches. These can reduce the probability of miscommunication and overreaction. That would lead you perhaps to think about establishing a dedicated communications network between governments, building on the experience of the OSCE, which does have such a network, and the experience of other governments with hotlines, as a means for rapid contact when speed can avert misinterpretation of a state's actions or intentions. Just thinking now about this present circumstances that we're in the middle of, involving states of a special concern should be a priority objective in establishing such confidence or security building measures. The point being that keeping open lines of communication, let us say between Seoul and Pyongyang, between Seoul, Pyongyang, Tokyo, Beijing, Washington, would be, I think, in and of itself, a useful objective, a useful accomplishment to provide a framework, a platform within which communications can take place. Maybe not every day, maybe not every week, but having established that sort of basic framework in which communications can take place seems to me would be a useful accomplishment. So I leave that as a point of departure for further discussion about non-legally binding yet negotiated approaches to confidence and security building.
All right, thank you so much, Dr. Gordon. Third speaker is Professor Matthew Kronig of Georgetown University, whom I believe that you are very well familiar with his publication in major journals such as American Political Science Review and International Organization on a wide range of security issues. Matt?
Great, thank you. Well, I'd like to begin by thanking our hosts, the Asan Institute. I think I speak on behalf of everyone when I say this has been a meticulously planned and executed and more importantly, intellectually stimulating conference. So thank you. The question I was asked to address today is, what can the international community do to bolster the counterproliferation regime? And in my remarks, I'm going to argue that the primary constraint on effective counterproliferation isn't capabilities, but it's interests and norms. And that therefore, the most important thing we can do to strengthen the counterproliferation regime is to develop a new set of norms, a new set of principles, based on the idea that the international community has not only a right, but a responsibility to intervene to prevent nuclear proliferation. And this includes use of coercive tools and includes, as a last resort, military force. So in short, what I'm proposing today is an R2PP, a responsibility to prevent proliferation. So the rest of my remarks will proceed in three parts. First, I'll discuss in some more detail what I see as the primary constraints on proliferation today. Next, I'll discuss an analogous case, the change in international human rights norms over the past few decades and the development of this idea of R2P, the responsibility to protect. And finally, I'll conclude by discussing an R2PP and what a responsibility to prevent proliferation would look like and how that could help our efforts. So first, as I said, I think the primary constraint today isn't capabilities, but interests and norms. So if you look at the capabilities required to, say, conduct interdictions of sensitive nuclear material on the high seas, the US Navy has those capabilities. If you look at the capabilities required to conduct preventive strikes on nuclear facilities in Iran, North Korea, or elsewhere, the United States, other countries have those capabilities. I think the primary constraint is really interest and norms. So let me discuss each of those in turn. First, interest. So it seems to me like there are many countries that believe they have a strong interest in preventing proliferation. But there are also many countries, way too many countries, from my point of view, that put their short-term interests in maintaining economic relations with proliferators, of maintaining good political relations with proliferators, of preventing internal destabilization of proliferators, above their long-term interest, and I would argue their more important interest in preventing nuclear proliferation and preventing nuclear war. So if you look at the case of Iran, for example, a case that I know best, the United States for a decade now has been trying to put in place a tough international sanctions regime, and it's made a lot of progress, but there are many countries that have been kicking and screaming along the way. And so that's obviously weakened the international sanctions regime, and these countries argue, well, we're in Iran's region, we're going to be there forever, we want to maintain good relations with them, we don't want to be seen as the bad guy. Many other countries saying, well, we want Iranian oil, sanctions against Iran or military strikes against Iran are going to be bad for oil supplies, are going to be bad for our interests. So obviously, these kind of short-term interests are weakening counterproliferation there. A second problem, I think, is with international norms. So there are strong norms going back to Westphalia about non-intervention in the internal affairs of other countries, strong norms embedded in the UN Charter about the non-use of military force except in specific situations. So there are many people in the international community, including in the United States, who start as kind of a first principle that using military force to prevent proliferation is illegitimate and unacceptable. And so again, if we look at the Iran case, if it gets to the point that the United States, that President Obama decides to conduct preventive military strikes against Iran's nuclear facilities, something that I see as fairly likely, I think, over the coming 18 months, something we can talk about in Q&A. But if it gets to that point, I have no doubt that many in the United States, many in the international community will be outraged, will condemn the United States, will treat the United States as the pariah and the outlaw, and not the proliferator Iran, and not on the countries standing on the sidelines allowing Iran to develop nuclear weapons. So in short, these norms and interests, I think, hinder our counterproliferation efforts by raising the international political cost of taking decisive action against proliferators. But it doesn't have to be this way necessarily, which brings me to my next point. If we look at the development of the international human rights regime, we've seen an interesting evolution. So there you also had similar kind of short-term interests trumping what may be more important interests. You had countries that didn't believe that they had an interest to intervene for humanitarian reasons in specific cases. So we can think of Rwanda in 1994, for example, and the genocide there. The United States and Europe potentially had the ability to intervene to prevent genocide in Rwanda, yet they decided not to, in part because they thought sub-Saharan Africa is not an important strategic region. We don't have kind of narrow, self-interested reasons to intervene in this case. Also, I think norms were an important constraint on humanitarian interventions. Because, again, you had these strong norms against non-intervention in the internal affairs of other countries, strong norms against the use of military force, but these were clashing continually against this norm of preventing humanitarian disasters, preventing mass atrocities. And over time, over the past decades, what we've seen is that human rights advocates have argued that mass atrocities, genocide, ethnic cleansing, are so important that we can't stand by as they happen, that they're unacceptable. And so they've elevated them above these norms of non-intervention, above these norms against the use of force. And this culminated, I think, in R2P, the responsibility to protect. Many of you are probably familiar with it. It has 3 pillars. But the most important pillar for our purpose is this pillar that says that the international community has not only a right, but a responsibility to intervene in other countries to prevent mass atrocities, and that they can use coercive measures if necessary, and that military force remains a last resort to prevent these mass atrocities. Now we can be skeptical about whether norms matter or not. I'm sometimes skeptical that norms matter, but I think it's hard to argue that R2P hasn't had real effects on the ground. It's been crystallized in a number of important international agreements, and I think it was one contributing factor to the US and NATO decision to intervene in Libya to topple Colonel Gaddafi in 2011. So again, we can agree or disagree about whether that specific intervention made sense, but it's hard to argue, I think, that R2P hasn't had real effects. Okay, so what does this mean for nuclear nonproliferation? Well, I personally believe that the spread of nuclear weapons poses a grave threat to international peace and security. I personally believe that nuclear war would be an unimaginable catastrophe that we must work to prevent. And I think that I'm preaching to the choir. I think that we're all here because we do believe that the spread of nuclear weapons is a grave threat to international peace and security. But I think if we truly believe that, we should follow the example of the human rights advocates and argue that nuclear proliferation is truly unacceptable, not just in our language, but also in our actions, and raise the norm of nuclear nonproliferation above the norm of non-intervention, above the norm of against the use of military force. So what that would mean essentially is developing this idea of an R2PP, responsibility to prevent proliferation. So much like the R2P, an R2PP would suggest that the international community has not only a right, but a responsibility to intervene to prevent proliferation, and that this includes using coercive measures and includes using military force as a last resort. When it comes time to take difficult decisions then about whether we're going to use force or not to prevent nuclear proliferation, I think what this would mean in practice is that we shouldn't condemn the counter-proliferators. These are countries that are taking difficult decisions, taking decisions that are sacrificing, that they incur cost in order to prevent the spread of nuclear weapons. So in short, we shouldn't condemn the counter-proliferators. Rather, I think our ire should be directed at those countries that are putting their short-term and mean economic interests above humanity's interests in preventing the spread of nuclear weapons. I think our outrage should be directed at those countries that stand idly by as the world's most dangerous weapons spread. Thank you.
Great, thank you. The fourth and last speaker of the panel is Dr. Jim Walsh, a research associate and faculty at the Security Studies program at MIT. Also author of many publications, including Egypt's Nuclear Future, Proliferation or Restraint, and Sanctions Cannot Be the Centerpiece. Dr. Walsh?
Thank you. I'm loud, aren't I? I'll try to stop that. First, I'll thank the audience. It's late in the conference, and you still have showed up for this late panel, and I appreciate that. And I also want to thank, with the rest of the panelists, ASAN. This is my second ASAN conference, and I think I can say honestly that these are the greatest conferences I've ever attended. I've never attended conferences like this. If you came to MIT and we had a conference, I would give you bread and water, and the agenda would be badly photocopied by graduate students. So never have I been to something like this. Now, the good news is, if you went to one of these conferences at MIT, you would not see my face on a screen that size. I think, talk about responsibility to protect, I think we should do something about that. Because it's late, I'm going to be a little provocative. I'm going to throw a few stones here. Let me first explain how I think of counterproliferation. I remember being a young graduate student in the early 1990s when the term was first coined. The Cold War had ended, the Department of Defense was shopping around for a new rationale, and then there was this idea, well, we could get into the counterproliferation game. And then slowly, by the mid-1990s, you started to have articles, and then it really picked up after 2000. I take counterproliferation as distinct from non-proliferation as a set of policies that focuses its methods on a particular target and is aggressive, in some cases kinetic. Among its instruments are military strikes, cyber attacks, sabotage, the use of non-state actors opposed to the target government to carry out intelligence or other operations, assassinations, pressure on procurement networks, sanctions for the purpose of denying technology acquisition, and outing. And I want to emphasize that while the term is new, the term of art is relatively new, these concepts are very old. Israel has used assassinations against scientists working in Egypt's program back in the 1960s. Used assassination against Iraqi scientists for Iraq's nuclear program. The U.S. approached the Soviet Union in the 1960s, suggesting that a nuclear weapons program in China should be attacked in combination by the U.S. and the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union demurred on that request. I think looking back, that was probably the wise decision and might inform our sense of restraint going forward. In fact, if you look at the list of countries or the list of occasions, and I'll get to this in a moment, countries have often thought about attacking, preempting, using military force against potential proliferators. In almost every case, they've demurred and demurred for good reasons, and I think we can look back in history and be happy that that was the case. But we'll talk about more of that in a moment. Let me say, though, but the mention of China in the 1960s and the U.S. Proposal by Dean Russ to nuke China in response to its nuclear weapons program reminds me that I've heard, I'm just going to take this as a personal moment, I've heard a lot of talk during this conference of doom and gloom. You know, woe are we. North Korea is the rising power. We are constrained. There's nothing we can do. This is terrible. As someone who has been to North Korea, I can tell you that if North Koreans were here, they'd be thrilled to hear all this. And I think it's worth reminding ourselves that this is a country whose economic strength ranks near the bottom of the global rankings. We should also, coming back to history, remind ourselves of other countries that I think you could plausibly argue were much more worrisome at the time. I mean, think about Mao's nuclear weapons program. There's a reason why Dean Rusk was suggesting this. Mao had said that he would fight a nuclear war and win. He said he would give nuclear weapons to other countries. There was talk then of the Peking, Hanoi, Jakarta axis. This is a long time ago. China remains the only country to test a live nuclear missile over its own territory. You want to talk about rogue, dangerous countries? That was China under Mao. So I don't think North Korea has anything on China in that time period. And I would argue that Pakistan, has nuclear weapons, has provided sensitive nuclear materials to other countries. I mean, it's pretty much done all the things, only worse than we fear about for North Korea. So, I think North Korea is a terrible situation. And I think we've got some tough choices and lots of things to wrestle with here. But I think it's worth keeping it in context that this is not the first time world history has been here. And in some cases, it's actually been more challenging. So I think we should buck up a little on this one. Let me go back to the core issue here. And that is, the rise of counterproliferation as a concept. As I said, it started in the mid-1990s, became increasingly popular in the 2000s, and people loved it. They loved it. Why? Non-proliferation is boring. Your father did non-proliferation. It's a bunch of lawyers and diplomats talking yak, 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 and that's just the people you know. Then you have to sit down and talk to your adversary, and God, no, who wants to do that? It's much more exciting to think about cool technology that we can use. And that we can go and make things happen so that we don't have to talk to our adversary. We don't even have to involve them. We can simply go and attack them or with cyber or whatever it's going to be. It's just so much easier, and you can solve all your problems by pushing a button. The only problem is it's not true. It's just not true. I would say it's not true empirically. That as a matter of history, the results from counterproliferation run across a continuum that roughly goes from irrelevant to ineffective to counterproductive. Now, I'm exaggerating, of course. I think PSI has been useful. I think there are some other elements that have been useful, and I can imagine that it might be useful in the future. I think the best case for counterproliferation, at least on the military strike end, is probably Syria, although even in that case, the best case, I think, for that perspective, the results are a little hard to have known in the long term insofar as Assad immediately faced a revolution, but we'll set that aside. When you look at the military aspect of it, I can only count 2 or 3 instances of preventive military strikes against nuclear facilities that did not occur in the context of a war between belligerents. Furman and Krebs count 19 cases where states considered attacks. In 11 of the 18 cases, the attacker demurred. And the 7 that did happen, they happened in the context of an ongoing war, World War II and the Iran-Iraq War. In other words, these weren't wars of proliferation. There was a war, and then amongst the targets being attacked were nuclear targets within the war. So I count as the 3 possible examples of counterproliferation military strikes is Israel's attack against Osirak, Israel's attack against Syria, and then, people can dispute this, and I don't know quite how to code it, but the U.S. war against Iraq, is that a war of proliferation? Even if there's no weapons of mass destruction? I don't know. But in any case, I'm willing to count the Syrian case as a provisional success. I count the Israel's attack against Osirak as a negative outcome. Prior to that attack, Saddam's nuclear weapons program was one of several exotic weapons programs which were foundering. After the attack, he focused like a laser on this program. He released physicists from prison. He made it job one, and it got a tremendous amount more political priority and resources, and then the program started to make progress. Then, of course, other events intervened, but the attack served to focus the state and make nuclear weapons a priority. Now, in the nonproliferation world, we have lots of little groups. Some people think supply is important. Other people think demand is important. I actually think the most important thing to being a successful proliferator is attaching political priority to the program. The folks who get the bomb are the folks who say, I want it now, it's going to be job one. The states that don't get it are the ones who say, yeah, I'd like to have a capability, that sounds nice, we'll see where it goes, and then it sort of gets away from them over time. Governments change, earthquakes, wars, and they never quite get there. But the folks who say, I want it now, it's important, they tend to get it. And in the case of Iraq, when you bomb them, and I think in the case of Iran, if you bomb them, the next day they're going to wake up and say, oh yeah, we want it, and we want it now. So I think there's a mixed record there. The other instruments, cyber, assassinations, I think they've been used to little effect, sometimes with unintended consequences. Of the list, I think pressure on procurement networks and PSI is good. I think outing countries is good. I think social media, mapping, sort of crowdsourcing on what states are doing, I think that's going to prove very powerful in the future going forward. But, let's take that record and contrast it with boring old nonproliferation, which I think is arguably the biggest public policy success of the 20th century. Everyone predicted that we would live in a world of dozens of nuclear weapon states. Go back and look at every prediction, even into the 70s, even into the 80s, and that didn't happen. And why didn't it happen? It didn't happen because of counterproliferation. It happened because of non-proliferation. It happened because states, through consensus and with legitimacy, agreed on restraints through the NPT and on other sorts of actions. There were roughly 30 states that started down the path towards nuclear weapons, some in very small ways, some in very significant ways, who stopped and reversed course. The rate of proliferation peaked in the 1960s and has declined since. And it's no coincidence the NPT was signed in 1970. I think non-proliferation has worked in a way that no one could possibly have guessed and that we should all be deeply thankful for. And so when I compare that record to the promise of counterproliferation, it seems to me the two are not even close. Now, at the end of the day, I think it's good to have counterproliferation alternatives. Because, of course you want to prepare for all sorts of contingencies and possibilities. So I think we should develop them. But what I worry about, particularly in the United States, is that a U.S. obsession, like a U.S. obsession with sanctions, a U.S. obsession with counterproliferation, undercuts or distracts us from the hard, unpleasant, but shockingly effective world of nonproliferation, diplomacy, as boring as it is, that has delivered us from evil in the 20th century. I'll stop there. Thank you.
All right, thank you. Before we open up to general audience, as a moderator and as a person who attended Dr. Walsh's talk after his trip to Pyongyang when I was in Washington, D.C., and we have Matt Kroenig, who wrote a very provocative article with a title, Time to Attack Iran, sitting right next to you. I have to ask you this.
As long as it wasn't, it's time to attack Walsh. You didn't say that.
No.
We believe that you are capable of engaging civil conversation while sitting next to each other. So, with North Korea's third nuclear test, do you still believe engagement should be the best option?
Is that to me?
Yes. For both North Korea and Iran.
Yeah. So let me quickly answer separately. I don't think that we're going to see much engagement. I think we're caught in a cycle of provocation, sanction, which makes it difficult for policymakers after a provocation to then turn and try to engage the provocateur because it makes them look weak. So I don't think that's going to happen. But let me say this with respect to North Korea. Because we're in this cycle, the thing that I fear is that with 4 new leaders, Abe isn't new, but 4 new people in office in the major powers in Asia, some who have very little experience, for example, in North Korea with foreign affairs and security policy, I fear that the real danger is not the nuclear weapon tomorrow or whatever, but rather we're going to get a situation in which someone makes a mistake, miscalculation, misperception, fishermen go into waters and get shot. Something happens, a la the island shelling. And because of changes made in both countries' military doctrine, we're going to get crisis escalation. You know, the current South Korean military doctrine is proactive deterrence, and it's forward-leaning. So I worry about small incidents leading to crisis escalation and conventional war of, shorter, and I'm not saying it's more likely than not, but I think the odds have increased. Under those conditions, I think we need to be talking. Now, that's not necessarily engagement. I think, during what did we learn from the Cuban Missile Crisis? We should talk to the Soviet Union, even if they're
What about
adversaries.
using incentives? Because I'm not supposed to remember what you said, but in 2008,
I love this. Go ahead.
right, but wrote an article supporting dialogue and engagement with Iran,
Yes.
based upon the NIE report that
Yes.
Iran was still many years,
Oh, and I definitely support engagement with
So
Iran.
if I may quote
Yeah.
you, then a proposal that is all restrictions and no benefits is unlikely to be appealing or sustainable.
I agree. That's brilliant. I don't know who you're quoting, but I think that's
you wrote
awesome.
It. You wrote it. So does it still apply to Iran and potentially North Korea?
It does. It does. So I am sticking with that position. I think you have to have dialogue. You don't get deals in which one side gets 100% and the other side gets 0. Both sides have to get something to be able to go back to their domestic populations and claim victory. I just don't think that's politically feasible with North Korea right now. I think it is maybe feasible with Iran. We'll see but even there I'm a little skeptical. But I think that's the way to go. I think it's diplomacy that yields results, as difficult as it may be. So yes.
Dr. Kroenig, R2PP?
Yes. Well, first I'd like to comment on a couple of things Jim said, and then I'll respond to this question of how to deal with Iran and North Korea. So I think that Jim compares the records of counterproliferation and nonproliferation and argues that nonproliferation has been more successful, and I would agree with that. But there's a selection effect problem there, right? I mean, nonproliferation are the easy cases. Counterproliferation are the hard cases. So to say the hard cases are harder than the easy cases is true by definition. So I agree with that. I would say that counterproliferation has been more successful than Jim suggests, however. I mean, so we can get into debates back and forth about whether OSIRAC was successful or not. But at the end of the day, there have been 4 countries that have had nuclear facilities bombed: Nazi Germany, Iraq, Iran, and Syria. And none of those countries have nuclear weapons today. And at the end of the day, that's what we care about. So going to how do we deal with Iran and North Korea, I think in both cases we have 5 possible approaches and 5 possible outcomes. So the first is to try to negotiate, solve it diplomatically. Second would be to live with it and acquiesce to a nuclear-armed Iran or a nuclear North Korea. Third would be to take military action. Fourth would be to try to do it covertly through cyber and sabotage. Fifth would be to do nothing and wait it out and hope for some kind of regime change. So I think in both cases, if we could solve it diplomatically, that would be best. I don't think there's really much disagreement about that. So I mean, if Iran were willing to give up its uranium enrichment program today, I would go out and have a drink in Seoul and celebrate, and I hope you all would join me.
Are you buying?
On me, I think, if they give it up. And so I think, similarly, in the case of North Korea, if we could solve it diplomatically, that would be wonderful. I don't have much optimism that we can solve either of these problems diplomatically, however. The record there hasn't been good if we're going to look at track records. So second would be to live with it. We all say nuclear proliferation in Iran, nuclear proliferation in North Korea is unacceptable, and we could go through all the horrible things that could go wrong with nuclear weapons in both cases. So I think that's not a good option, probably the worst option in both cases. So I'm going to skip over the third option, the military option, for now and go to fourth, cyber and sabotage. So I think this is something that Jim and I actually agree on. I don't think that that's going to be enough to solve either problem. So we've seen in Iran that there have been assassinations, cyber attacks, sabotage going on for years. But every 3 months in the IAEA reports, just looking at objective measures of progress in Iran's nuclear program, looking at amounts of LEU being produced, number of centrifuges going online, every 3 months those things go up and up and up, despite all this covert stuff going on. So the covert stuff is probably helping. That increase probably would have been steeper without the covert stuff, but on its own it's not going to be enough. Fifth is potentially just waiting, hoping that the regime changes in both countries and some other new government comes to power that's going to be more likely to negotiate. In Iran, I don't think that's a realistic option, just because the nuclear clock is ticking much faster than the regime change clock is ticking. So we're going to have to make difficult decisions, I'm afraid, on whether to strike or not before any kind of regime change takes place. In North Korea, my sense is also that it would be kind of naive to hope that the regime changes tomorrow, but I don't follow North Korea as closely as Iran. So this brings us to the military option. And so the military option in Iran and in North Korea are very different. And there are two major differences as I see them. First, the military option is much more viable in Iran. We know where the key facilities are, and we can destroy them. In North Korea, we don't know where the material is, we don't know where the plutonium is, we don't know where this enrichment facility is that Sig Hecker was shown. So our ability to find and destroy the nuclear facilities is much more difficult in the North Korean case. Second, in terms of the potential cost and consequences, both Iran and North Korea could and likely would retaliate if they were attacked. The kind of retaliation that Iran could inflict, I think, in my judgment, would be retaliation that the international community could absorb and would be less catastrophic than allowing Iran to have nuclear weapons. In the North Korean case, I'm not so sure. I think the kind of retaliation that North Korea could direct at Seoul would be much greater than anything the Iranians could muster. So I think the military option is much less attractive in North Korea than it is in Iran.
Okay, I expect two of them to give a definite answer to solve North Korean problem, but they have not. So I'll just open up to the general audience for questions. Prime Minister, there should be a microphone.
So Gareth Evans from Australia, and I'm afraid I have to comment on Matt Kroning's embrace of the responsibility to protect concept, of which I think it's widely known as one of the prime movers in the human rights context that he assiduously and enthusiastically describes. Responsibility to prevent proliferation. If the argument is that the concept of limitations on sovereignty and a wider responsibility to the international community than just doing your own thing behind sovereign boundaries is a concept that could be applied sensibly to the nuclear context, I agree with him wholly, because there's an awful lot to be said for getting out of that normative environment in which a number of countries, the Brazils and Argentinas and God knows who else, are saying basically, sovereignty entails a responsibility to do our own thing, and we're not going to have any wider obligations. I think that's something that's very important to cut through, and one way of cutting through it is to, by analogy with the human rights context, say it is now widely accepted that sovereignty carries with it wider responsibilities to the international community when it comes to global public good. So to that extent we're on common ground. But when you use it as a springboard, as you do, for creating a normative environment for going hell for leather on the military front, I'm afraid here's where I reach for my own revolver. Basically for two reasons. I mean, one, I spent the last 10 years trying to deal with the response to the human rights norm by large swathes of particularly the developing world, who say that this is just another demonstration of the enthusiasm of the West for never seeing a problem that doesn't have a military solution, and just give these guys an inch and they'll take a mile. So in terms of protecting my own norm, as it were, from that particular ongoing assault, which has now come back to life post-Libya with the perception of overreach by NATO and everything else, I just have the horrors about another whole enthusiastic embrace of responsibility to protect in another context, which is just going to completely reinforce that kind of reaction. But more importantly, in the present context, I really do think to talk about sort of military sharp-end response as a kind of routine part of the repertoire of this new normative thing is very dangerous stuff indeed, unless at the very least you accompany it with the kind of very careful attention to criteria that has been very much part of the debate in the human rights context. When we talk about military interventions to protect from genocide and other mass atrocity crimes, it's not only in the context of last resort, it's in the context of satisfying criteria of proportionality, and in particular the criterion of balance of consequences, that careering in with a military assault is not going to do more harm than good. And I have to say that I don't hear much of that detailed attention to the proportionality criterion, and I don't hear much attention in what you've said, at least today, to the balance of consequences thing. And on that, I guess it will be a matter for judgment in each particular case what the balance of consequences actually are, and it's something about which you can have an argument. But I frankly have to say that on what I've heard you say so far, and particularly in the context of Iran, and sort of downplaying the kind of consequences that would flow from an assault on Iran, I'm very profoundly worried about that kind of approach taking root, and my instincts, for what they're worth, are much closer to those articulated by Jim Walsh. But I'm just, I've spent my life dealing with the Anne-Marie Slaughters of this world and others who love military solutions, love the concept of responsibility to protect, love the idea of using it in a wider context than the extreme mass atrocity crime in which it was originally evolved. So I have to say I'm a little bit nervous about hearing it embraced. I suppose I should be flattered, but I'm a little bit nervous about hearing it embraced without any of the accompanying sort of paraphernalia of caution that this shrieks out to be applied if you're going to apply it in this context.
Professor Gordon, you would like to
Well,
add?
just to make an observation about this dialogue on broadening the R2P to R2PP, I would have thought that, in fact, given the action in the United Nations in 1992, when the notion of what constitutes threats to international peace and security was broadened to include proliferation as a matter that could be dealt with under Chapter 7 by the Security Council as a problem for international peace and security, would provide already a framework within the United Nations for Security Council decisions to ultimately take military action to enforce a decision by the Council that related to non or to proliferation, or reversing it, or let's take the case of North Korea. They're a member of the UN, they're there, and in principle, the Security Council can take a decision to deal with what's happening.
Thank you. Why don't we collect more questions? Yes, sir. Microphone in the middle, please.
Hi, Ken Bro from the United States. There's been some talk about the concept of counterproliferation, the political priority. I think you kind of missed the boat, and I'd like to get your reaction to it, because counterproliferation, you've been talking about it sort of at one end of the continuum. But the concept is broader than that, because to come back to Professor Walsh's point, when something gets a political priority, suddenly it matters. There has to be a political decision to start a program in the first place. And if you're really going to do counterproliferation, you're not working at the back end where the consequences can be high, as Gareth has just pointed out. You want to identify the decision and the decision makers at the beginning of the process, when you actually have more opportunity for leverage than you do after you have an establishment that's committed to a path and a course of action and has invested an awful lot of money in it. So I'd like you to comment on that idea. How do you get the focus to shift from responding to proliferation, which is really what the CP that's been described up here is not really CP, it's responding to proliferation. How do you get to the front end and you really counter proliferation by stopping it before it begins, by recognizing it and then beginning to address the causes that make people want to do those things?
Right, thank you. Gentleman right behind. Yeah.
Ahmet Han from Turkey. Well, upon hearing Mr. Kroning's comments, I have that question. I will not be questioning the validity of the logic. I mean, you can attack Iran because you can master the consequences, but you can't attack Korea, North Korea, because you cannot master the consequences kind of logic. That might be true. Still, I have some issues with the, or I'll take some issues with the overall structure of the logic. Now, because in short, how I read your assessment is that because North Koreans are crazy, you can't attack them, and Iranians are more rational. Well, doesn't this, in a way, encourage Iranians to be irrational and crazy too? For example, if they have fissile material after the attack still somewhere stockpiled, wouldn't they be much more inclined to give it out to, say, Hezbollah, to use it on Israel, God forbid? I mean, this is really something that I don't think that the international community could muster. And if we set the standard there, I mean, if you're irrational, I can't attack you, but if you're rational, or if you're like, you look like more like a state, you know, some mechanisms, democratic or otherwise, then I can attack you. Well, how does it help exactly to counter proliferation? I'm not sure. Thank you.
Why don't we get responses from, starting from Professor Kronig?
Okay,
Get more.
well, first, to Garrett Evans' comment, and I guess the first thing I would say is I think I agree with almost everything you said, except maybe some of the precise, the specifics on the Iran issue I think I might disagree with. But overall, I think I agree. I had 5 to 7 minutes, so I couldn't spend much time spelling out my logic, but I think it was clear from my earlier response to the Iran-North Korea distinction that I do think the criteria are important for how you would judge the use of military force, and in specific cases, you need to make a case-by-case judgment. On addressing proliferation early rather than late, I think that's exactly right. The further you get along, the more difficult these cases get. And I think the Supreme Leader now judges that he's a few months away from having nuclear weapons that would do a lot to bolster the security of his regime, bolster his goal of becoming the most dominant, leading the most dominant state in the Middle East. So it's a much harder problem to deal with now than it was, I think, 10 years ago. I don't know, I do think that the United States, at least, makes a lot of efforts to do kind of counter-proliferation on the front end, and I think we see that now after the North Korean test. We're doing a lot in East Asia with our allies to try to reassure them that they can depend on the United States for their security, that they're under the U.S. nuclear umbrella, and that they don't need to develop independent nuclear capabilities. So I think that's just one example of the way the United States tries to address proliferation concerns at the front end and doesn't always wait until the last minute. On the question about Iranian retaliation versus North Korean retaliation, so I've written the article "Time to Attack Iran," so you can see which is not a title I chose, by the way. I think slightly more provocative than the actual content of the article. But I think you can see my logic in there, and it's really more, it's not about North Koreans being crazy or Iran being rational, it's really more about capabilities. But I should say, I know the Iranian case much better than the North Korean case. I've been working on Iran's nuclear program almost full-time for the past 3 years, including as an advisor in the Department of Defense. So thought a lot about Iranian military capabilities, their likely retaliatory options in the event of a U.S. strike, things the United States could do to deter Iranian retaliation, specific types of Iranian retaliation, to degrade their ability to do other types. So I thought a lot about that case. My sense is the kind of North Korea retaliation that North Korea could inflict would be much worse than what Iran could do. But I know that case less well. So.
Can I get in on all of this? First, I think Matt's to be congratulated. For originality and trying to be provocative, and that's what we need. We need creativity in thinking about these things. I'm a little scared by the whole notion that, frankly, this is the ticket where we all get to attack each other. But, be that as it may, and there's no way that you could have articulated the full concept in 7 minutes. So but I think it's to be welcomed. I think the empirics are a little more challenging to say that, well, we've bombed 4 countries and they didn't get a bomb, so therefore that's the result that follows. Well, there are the 30 countries we didn't bomb and they didn't get a bomb, so I think there's a little selection bias in that choice. And a little ahistoricism to suggest that all the cases in the past were easy, and it's only now that we have hard cases. I find that very hard to believe. Taiwan was a hard case, Japan was a hard case, Libya was a hard case, South Africa reversing was a hard. We've had plenty of hard cases. People just forget. They forget. There's a lot of history here that people forget. And on Iran, I've worked on Iran now for about 10 years, been 6 times. I'm going back to Iran next week. My view, I follow what the DNI says about Iran. The Directorate of National Intelligence, every year in testimony, says Iran has not yet made a decision to pursue nuclear weapons. It had a program in 2000. It had a program. It halted it in 2003, and has not yet made that decision, that bomb decision that I told you that I think is so important. I'm not worried about retaliation by Iran. What I worry about is they wake up the next morning and say, oh yeah, fine, we're going to make that decision. That's what I worry. I don't like the non-proliferation consequences of a counter-proliferation strike because I think it brings us the very thing we seek to avoid. To Ambassador Brill's point, I agree absolutely. Part of it is disciplinary bias. I think this is about political decision-making. And what you have to do is for each country early on, understand what the balance of bureaucratic forces are. Who wins and who loses in a weapons decision. In the old days, early in the nuclear age, prior to NPT, you had several nuclear establishments who were interested in nuclear weapons, not because they were interested in nuclear weapons, but because it was a way to keep their program going until they could get what they really wanted, which was nuclear power. Then NPT comes in and it reframes the issue for the internal decision makers. And it widens the issue, reframes it, and suddenly you get a different decision group. What would have been a defense decision made by a defense minister, a science minister, and a prime minister is now a foreign policy decision in which those folks are joined by other folks, the secretaries, a foreign minister, other people, and then the decision goes from 3 to 0 sitting at the table to 4 to 3. And what happens is those nuclear folks switch sides in their vote because they decide, the NPT says, well, if you don't join, you don't get peaceful uses. You don't get access to the technology. So they say, we're going to support NPT now because we care more about having a nuclear program. So you can affect the material interests of the people who have decision-making power within countries if you are willing to spend the time to think as carefully about that and begin to shape those interests. You frame the issue and you go after particular constituencies. You try to shut out some and recraft it so you bring others in and you get to change the balance of decision-making power. So I think you're right, that's where the tough work needs to get done, and it's easier done early than late.
Thank you. Questions? Yes, sir. Gentleman at the back, and you have the last question.
Thank you.
I'll give you each speaker to make a concluding remark.
Thank you. David Centauro from the Pacific Forum CSIS. This is a question for Jim. And this is basically to come back about your point about escalation control and the fact that this is the real danger, basically, that, if there's a low level of provocation, how do we control escalation, particularly escalation to the nuclear level? And in thinking about this, I wonder whether the focus should be more on alliance coordination and management than on North Korea, because we talk a lot about the danger posed by North Korea, but I wonder if instead the real danger is if the United States and its allies are unable to coordinate their policy. And it seems to me that this is really where the real hard work needs to be done. So I was wondering whether you could comment on that. Thank you.
And we need microphone at the center. Could you just, oh, yeah.
Hi, I'm Josh Pollack from SAIC. I had a brief question about interdiction. There seems to be a consensus on the panel that PSI has been a success. And two questions about that. How do we measure that? And why are we talking about PSI as opposed to UN Security Council Resolution 1874, which actually provides states with the right and the responsibility to intercept suspect shipments from and to North Korea?
All right, thank you, Josh. We will go in reverse order. That means Dr. Walsh will make the concluding remark, including response to questions. And going back this way.
Great. Let me go to your question about escalation. I agree totally that, we focus, all of us naturally, rightly focus on North Korea, right? It's the problem state. It's the one that waves its hand. The eyes are drawn to the light. But there are other ways to get to war that involve us, right? And we don't talk about that so much. And Americans don't talk about their friends, the South Koreans, and their military doctrine that they've changed to proactive deterrence. Proactive deterrence means disproportionate punishment rather than tit for tat. Pre-delegation to local commanders, being able to hit every target in North Korea, which to the North Koreans looks like use them or lose them, right? Puts them in a short fuse. One makes them wonder how long they're going to be able to hold on to their assets. That's all that's escalatory pressure. So I think we do have to have better coordination. And I think, the Americans are in a difficult position. What do we want? What does American policy want to do more than anything else? It wants to reassure South Korea. It wants South Korea to know rightly that we have your back, that you are not alone. At the same time, it wants to encourage restraint. And it's hard to do both things at the same time. So I agree, coordination is important. On the issue of measurement, I think you're absolutely right. And I don't have, good data to quote back at you. But I do take the point, and it's the point that you made, Pierce, as well, that when we have instrumentalities that are already legitimate and that are sitting and present and actionable, then we should go to those first before we begin to think about what are going to be perceived as less legitimate unilateral actions. I mean, if the power's there at the international level, and it's been used, we've used the Security Council on North Korea, then I would certainly prefer that over the alternative. Again, I agree we need to have these contingencies, and we need to have these plans and capabilities. I just worry that what has got us here is underappreciated, and the actions we take are going to undermine the very thing that got us to a good spot to begin with.
Thank you. Dr. Krohn?
I guess just as a last comment, I would say I think some of the comments on the panel suggest that there's somehow a trade-off and that we have to choose either non-proliferation or counter-proliferation, and that's certainly not the way I see it. I see them as working together, as non-proliferation being kind of the first line of defense, but that when non-proliferation fails, as it has in the case of Iran and North Korea, then you need to turn to other options, and that counter-proliferation is kind of the second line of defense and a layered defense approach to preventing the spread of nuclear weapons. So I would hate for someone to come away from this thinking that they somehow have to choose between them, because I really do think that they go together and complement each other.
Thank you.
Well, this gets, I think, a little bit back again to the question of what we mean by these words, because if you're looking at North Korea, they have tested a weapon. As far as I know, Iran has not. So there's still a continuum there, and it actually goes on beyond the first test, which gives the lie a little bit, if I can go back to my own specialty about test ban, that the little argument that says, well, anybody can proliferate without testing. Well, testing is a key component of going up that ladder in terms of vertical proliferation. So if you want to get at it, you're going to have to get at it at various different places along that continuum. And if you look now at the case here with North Korea, it seems to me that to get at it, if indeed you can still try to pursue the negotiating track, the way to do that is to optimize your way of communicating with the other side, not only bilaterally but multilaterally, and that gets back to sort of where I started in terms of what the objective of this particular panel was, which was to look at sort of non-legally binding approaches, and that's why I focused on establishing communications links, either bilateral or multilateral, which you can then use, especially to deal with situations where you could have escalation over confrontations, and maybe just to have a dialogue that get you somewhere over time.
Thank you. Dr. Chen?
Thank you. Actually, there was no question posed upon me, but I'd like to make some comments. First of all, I think I agree with the CSBM measures and also this engagement. Actually, there's the one condition. There should be a will to coexist with other countries. If there's no such thing on the part of proliferator, there's no way for us to be successful in engaging the policy. So I like to emphasize engage from the strengths, not from the weakness. Otherwise, we will be sending wrong signal to the proliferators. So actually, Jim actually mentioned the extreme case of military options, but there are other military options. Actually, we should not overshadow the other most sophisticated military options by using the extreme cases. So we should be very careful on that one. And about how we can measure the success, how we can define the success of PSI, as I said before, PSI is still in the making. There should be more consensus-building measures among the countries in the region. Of course, this is a kind of norm-building process. This is voluntary participation. There is no legally binding action at all. But to encourage the voluntary participation, I don't know whether it's desirable to have this R2P2 issue, because actually it intervenes, it actually contracts the interest of possible participants in the PSI. So I don't know, but I support we have to raise the bar a little bit higher to prevent the further proliferation. But in order to have more participation, I don't know whether it's good to have higher standard at this point of time. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Please join me in thanking our four speakers for this very productive and informative session. Thank you. Pleasure.